I'm good. And the mic's working. Everybody happy? Let's go. All right, this is a talk on evolutionary security. We're going to go fast. Let me introduce myself. This is me. As you can see, I've been doing this for a while. This is what I do, but that's not what I'm talking about today. Going to try to compress 4 billion years of evolution into about 20 minutes. So let's see how well this works. Basically, the concept here is as humanity evolved, we had to face different challenges. We got different advantages. And the advantages and challenges that exist in the natural world are those that can actually help us in business, in IT, and everything. So, quick overview of evolution, and then we'll move on with life. So first we had cells, then cells evolved into globs. Globs had advantages over single cells. Those eventually became true animals, which had an advantage over the different globular clusters of life that we had then. Those evolved bones, teeth, things grew stronger, things grew faster. Legs allowed people or creatures to move on to land, which was important because there's less competition in different niches. You grew hair, I'm losing my audience. You grew hair, you were able to climb trees, live in the dark, live where it's cold, and start to get advantage over others, and started to develop social intelligence. This is where things get really interesting, because when social intelligence evolves, you get group protection. You have species protecting other members of the species, and you have evolutionary advantage where if you protect your own siblings, your own cousins, even if you don't reproduce, others can reproduce, and your own genetic line continues. As you get smarter, you get environmental intelligence. This is where we start to get humans involved in things, manipulating the environment that we have to their own advantage. Back in the day, they did that with stone tools. Today, we do it in the IT infrastructure. And then tools are where things get interesting. Now, natural evolution is biological in nature. The more complex an organization becomes, the more advantages it gets, but the longer generations tend to get, which means if you're going for evolutionary advantage, then you're in a situation where the longer you live, the slower you can evolve. Tools make the difference. Tools allow you to work with your intelligence, develop things within a generation, and effectively get intergenerational cycles doing interesting things that way. We see this with the various tools you just saw. You see this escalation between swords and shields. You see escalations in other areas. The work I'm working on is going to be much bigger than this, but we're limited in time today. This basically, tools are learning made manifest. As tools improve, so do attacks, so do defense. Each time you go through a cycle, whether it's a generational cycle or a learning cycle within a set of tools, things improve a little bit and a little bit more and a little bit more. In information technology, this is what's happening today. Technological evolution happening now looks like, as you get more data online, you have certain entities becoming bigger targets. As you have bigger targets, they get more effort, more focus from attackers. Back when we first started getting this sort of technology, we would see user identification only. We would see people trying to get password guessing as a type of attack. You would get people having to deal with managing login processes. Firewalls became new as the technology evolved, and attackers stopped going after simple credentials and started going after protocols. Then, to protect against that, we got stateful firewalls, and attackers started to focus on applications, because as the defense improved, the attackers just started going after other areas that became easier and easier to hit. Get into patch cycles, improved operations, looking to really address what the attackers are doing, and attackers started moving to information sharing. Okay? Information sharing is a critical component of this sort of evolutionary approach because teaching is effectively a force multiplier. We see this in the SANS community today. We see this in the offensive security communities. These are people that are trying to get defenders together to share knowledge, but it's in response to the fact that the attackers have been increasingly sharing knowledge for the last 10, 20 years. And every time they do that, they get better faster than we do. We're okay, but the attackers are much better. Okay. There we go. So we're in an arms race. Right now, we're finally at a point where businesses are blocking all incoming traffic, but things that's known good, and filtering outbound traffic. This is after over a decade of telling people that egress filtering is key. They're finally doing it because the market pressures, the evolutionary pressures, are finally forcing them to do this. They're moving sensitive stuff behind VPNs, and really the perimeter's getting pretty good. Technology there's pretty good. So the attackers, of course, have moved inside, focusing on the users, using spam, malvertising, social engineering to get their code to run on the actual endpoints. They're facing this sort of situation where the attackers are simply bypassing protection entirely. So defenses are becoming very complex. There are lots of economic reasons for that. I could give an entirely separate talk on why that's happening. Can't get into that now, but defensive technologies are massively complex and more complex than most defenders can actually use. So attackers are focusing on light, easy to bypass detection, and the advantages of whoever is in this evolutionary fight are compounding. Whoever wins is likely to keep winning. You've all heard the phrase, the rich get richer. Well, that happens, due to evolutionary pressure. The more resources you have, the easier it is to use those resources to gain advantage for subsequent cycles. Defenders are forced to move slow. If you're working in business, you're restricted by budget cycles, you're restricted by training abilities, laws, regulations, and institutional processes all exist to slow down cycles. Because in the past, if you move too fast, you cut corners, you make mistakes. But the mistakes are where you learn. And the attackers have been making mistakes over and over and over again, which is why they're kicking our ass right now. We're not only losing, we're losing faster every day. So, quick review of tiers of attacks. There's nothing terribly new here, but basically, I like to break things down into 4 tiers of attacks. Tier 1, I really call the background radiation of attacks. This is the malware from the 1980s. These are the people that are trying to, run as many attacks as they can, collect as many low-lying systems as they possibly can, and use them later. Tier 2, you have vertical-focused attacks. Malware cartels running in a campaign-based system. And the fact that it's campaign-based is critical. Get to that in a minute. At Tier 3, you have industry-focused attacks that steal intellectual property, trying to win the market. So the Nortel attack that you may have heard about was this type of attack. And then Tier 4 is your targeted, highly targeted attack. Your APT, back when it was a real thing before it was a marketing term. Stealing intellectual property as it's being developed. These guys focus on long-term presence. If you're dealing with Tier 1 attackers, basic AV, basic patching works fine. The advice people give to small businesses still works if the only attackers facing is Tier 1. At Tier 2, you need a full-fledged anti-malware system, whitelisting, sandbox, stuff like that, really focusing on competitive advantage. This is because true security requires vigilance. People are lazy, security weakens over time. And because at this level you start getting campaign-based attacks, you've got adversaries that are looking at specific industry verticals, specific industry type targets. So if you manage to build enough protection that you can block them, they're not only going to go away, they're going to go away to somebody else in your industry. So you gain competitive advantage by protecting against Tier 2 and Tier 3 attacks. Tier 3 is more difficult. You need to have operational practices, improvement, you need to have monitoring. This is where automation comes in. If you've ever tried to automate something and failed, odds are you're trying to automate at too low of a level. Automation only makes sense when you've protected the organization to a strong enough point that it's working against tier 2 attackers. So, like pharmaceutical companies that are fighting against their evolutionary battle, which is antibiotic-resistant bacteria and things like that, they have these constantly accelerating research and development cycles. If you're facing a similar problem, you have to build the same thing into your own process. The tier 4, there's no standardized advice. Everything's customized. Attackers going straight after you. The people giving the highly complex, highly technical talks, more likely to be useful there. Basically, your best weapon is knowledge. Know how the organization works so you know how it fails. Know where your weak points are so you know when they're exploited. And know what you do not yet know to develop a plan to learn around that. Complexity versus simplicity is how a lot of things break apart. Simple systems are easy to learn, but they tend not to do much. You don't have a lot of functionality in the simple systems. Complex systems do a lot, but they're not as easy to understand. So there's a bit of a trade-off, a bit of a consideration there. Now, if something goes wrong, simpler systems are easier to troubleshoot. You can recover more quickly, which is why smaller organizations that offer simple services and basic applications are far more resilient. You see a lot more people targeting, Microsoft than Plan 9. Now, there's a market presence reason for that, but there are also a lot more attacks you can launch against something as complex as Microsoft Windows than something as simple as the more targeted operating systems, QNX, Plan 9, NetBSD, stuff like that. It's just a lot harder to get into. Now, there are niches. As in, real life, the big messy world we live in, you've got these different niches that different animals live in. We have the same thing in the IT space. Microsoft followed an interesting path towards market dominance. When they first entered the market, they were coming up against pretty much Unix and VMS. However, compared to Unix, Microsoft had a very simple licensing model. Doesn't look that way now, but back then that was true. And as Windows succeeded, as Microsoft was used in more and more places, customers demanded more and more features. So we grew. We grew past Windows 3 to Windows NT, NT to 2000, all the way up to 2012, which is the presentation you just saw. As Windows grew more and more powerful, it grew too large to fit in certain niches. And that is really how Linux was able to get a foothold. Compared to Microsoft, Linux had an incredibly simple licensing model. It had incredibly simple technology, and it was able to take over the web hosting space. It was able to take over the embedded systems space. And now we're seeing a fight at the mobile space. As organizations mature, it's just like as organisms mature. Same process, growing out of niches into new niches and trying to prevent others from getting into those niches. Both strategies are valid. So look at this briefly. Evolution is an iterative process involving change. There are 3 types of evolution. Okay, the first is natural evolution. This is what we're all familiar with. You have, offspring that has different mutations, different traits. Now, the ones that survive win, the ones that don't lose. The more change you have, the more rapid improvement you get. But change can be either positive or negative. Oftentimes, it's negative. This is why if you get exposed to radiation, you're more likely to develop cancer than superpowers. Right? So, since changes are more likely to be negative, there's this magical point where if you start loading changes into an organism or into an organization, you're going to hit a point where the negative is going to outweigh the positive, and it's just going to die. Too few changes is also going to result in failure because the competition is going to outcompete you. Success means you have to move just fast enough to not get the bad mutations. The good mutations can multiply, the bad mutations just die off. And you increase speed generation to generation. Guided evolution is different. This is the tool-based evolution. This is where you think, okay, not a random change. What kind of change can I make that's more likely to work for me? Tool improvement is, I can make this better. We just saw this with the Recon NG talk this morning. That's a massive improvement over the earlier versions of those types of recon tools. But we see this with all tools. We see this with organisms too. Horses have been bred to run faster, pull heavier loads. Cows have been bred to make more milk. Technological improvement is directed by intelligence. It's just like evolution, but it's guided. The speed of the process is based on how quickly you can analyze current flaws, and that depends largely on the tool's complexity. This is why you see more rapid evolution in the open source space than the closed source space, because open source systems tend to be simpler because the people working on them want to develop code and want to do neat things. They don't want to uncover and trace labyrinthine, feature flows and things like that. Basically, it takes less time to make a new hammer than a new cow or a new orbital telescope. The last type of evolution is automated adaptation. This is where things evolve in a guided way through themselves, building tools that improve the next iteration of tools. We see this with metrics. This is a lot of the reasons why people talk about metrics being important. Simple question, is this change good or bad? Now, automated adaptation optimizes for the short term. It focuses on the now, allowing for faster change than other solutions. We see this with iterative chip design. We see it with malware, the polymorphic code where malware is automatically adjusting itself, building faster and faster and faster. And automated algorithms can allow for massively increasing iterations. Okay, so that was a very quick overview of evolution. So how do we use it? Okay, one is in the planning process. Okay, accelerating a team is easier said than done. The common way we like to do this is we make a plan, we then do it, and then we realize, whoops, there was a problem we didn't foresee. What are we going to do now? What I call lean security is basically the merging of security with lessons learned from lean manufacturing and agile development. And in that approach, it's really more of a, walk the path, assess what's going on, adjust your plan accordingly, and then develop a plan that's going to deal with what's likely to come. The faster you can sprint through these things, the faster you have these cycles of improvement, the better off you get. Basically, you want the map to conform to the world. The world is never going to conform to the map that you make. Okay, this way, as your goals and resources change, you can adapt. The disadvantage is it requires a lot more trust. It requires trust in the systems, trust in the people working in the organizations. It requires accountability for people. Okay, sprinting is faster and lighter. You can see this with prototyping. Anybody who's worked with a rapid prototyping system has experienced this. Anybody that's lived in an agile development shop has experienced this. Anybody that's only ever worked in government has probably never experienced this. So the problem comes down to systems. It's common to find rigid systems. We've been saying for years, for as long as I've been in the industry, that security belongs in development. Put it at the beginning of the process. It's cheaper there. It makes sense, except you never show up at the beginning of a process unless you're a developer. You're always, dropped into the middle of a mess. How do you deal with the mess? Often, you just have to hack something in. After the fact security is often the best you can do. In reality, though, we're usually just set with a broken system. We have to figure out, what do we do here? Generally, we isolate. But because people are lazy, because the attackers are constantly getting better, our isolation defenses degrade over time. And it causes problems. We can't really deal with this. So how do we do this? From an evolutionary perspective, if you're doing a natural evolution approach, you'd build something, let the attackers break it, rebuild it, let them break it again, rebuild it, let them break it again. In a guided evolution approach, you'd build it, let them break it, analyze what's going on, figure out how you can do it better, rebuild it, let them re-break it, and analyze again. Automated adaptation, though, requires loose coupling. If you're doing automated adaptation, you have the systems smart enough that they can adjust themselves, whether it's a technological system or a people-based system. Running a company as a group of cells where each cell can do its own thing works well. But it requires trust, it requires loose coupling, so if one thing fails, you can replace it easily. This is the key behind evolutionary security. You're never going to make the best technology. You're never going to make the best company. Evolution works by allowing the barely good enough to survive to the next generation. And then as the generations move faster, as each generation gets better, you wind up with something you never expected at the beginning that's a lot better down the road. You don't make things secure, you make them survivable. You make things survive the next cycle to the next cycle to the next cycle. Learning helps us do this. Now, quick view of the 80, everybody here has heard of the 80-20 rule, right? Okay. Quick review, you have a budget, you have a project. So we're getting to the practical stuff here. By the time you've burned through 20% of the budget, the project is 80% done, takes the rest of the budget to finish, and then in security we like to say we now have a wall, we're safe. But in reality, first 20% can turn into 80% protection. The rest of the budget doesn't get you to 100%. There's always going to be a security gap as far as how well things work. So this results in failure. Resources you spend shrinking that gap is resources that could be used elsewhere. So one rule I like to say is the 80-by-5 rule. Okay, suppose you spent two 20% chunks making two 80% effective layers of security. Okay, these are layers of security that are good enough to allow the business to survive until you can make the next round of improvements. You can then spend more of the budget to make additional layers. Okay, crappy security. It's never going to be perfect, it's never going to be great, but it's going to help you live until you get to the next iteration. You can hire the next round of people, you can purchase the next piece of equipment. Okay? Now, in a nutshell, that's what evolutionary security looks like. Evolutionary security is not perfect. There are modes of failure. One way that things can fail is genetically. You take a penguin and drop it in the middle of the Sahara, it doesn't matter how fast it's going to breed, it's not going to survive. There is genetics at play. There's something inherent in an organism that allows it to survive or not in an environment. The same is true for an individual, the same is true for an organization. Organization's limited by culture. If people can't take advantage of opportunities, change won't happen, and the organization will stagnate and die. If you take an animal, drop it in a room with no resources at all, no food, no water, it's going to die. Same thing happens with organizations. If you don't have money, people, or time, even if the culture supports change, change isn't going to happen, and the organization will die. Basically, faster cycles require fewer resources per cycle. Finally, evolution requires breeding. Two individuals reproduce by combining genes. The offspring inherits from both parents. Over time, this results in better and better individuals. In business, this is done with ideas. Ideas come from other firms, from the internet, from books, from articles, and from conferences like this. They're only successful, though, if they're transmitted, and this requires discussion, or as I like to call it, infosex. Organizations that don't do this are like small inbred populations. Small inbred populations will not survive. They, like everything else, will stagnate and die. If you want to do this yourself, there are four simple rules. 1, maximize time. Predetermine how valuable your knowledge is. 5 minutes. If something has 5 minutes of value and you spend 10 minutes learning on it, that's resources wasted. You need to conserve the resources to put it into this cycle process. Don't oversell. If you're doing change, understand what the change does. Promise people that the change is going to do what it does, but don't oversell it, because then you're going to take the resources away. It's going to slow down the cycles you're going through, and you will not survive. Don't cover your ass. Processes only work if you're honest. Be lucky, or if you want to maximize your luck, be passionate. This takes a lot of energy to make change. It takes a lot of energy to go to a company and say, we don't want to go for perfection. We want to go for the best we can get done. And, it's hard. So that's pretty much it. Evolutionary Security comic is in process. I wanted it done for the conference. It's not quite done. Lean Security comic that I've done before is available at the QR code if you want to scan it. And that's it.